The fortress of Juju had held out for nearly 40 days. By the time the Han Chinese army finally broke through, the stronghold was already collapsing into ruin. Smoke hung over the walls, dust filled the courtyards, and the defenders were worn down to almost nothing. These defenders were rebels, a faction of the Xiongnu, the powerful nomadic confederation that had long dominated the steppes of Central Asia. Their leader, Juju, had broken away and built his own base of power deep in Central Asia. He had raised an army, constructed a fortress, and tried to carve out control over the surrounding lands. The Chinese army had come to destroy him, and now, as Chinese soldiers poured through the shattered defenses, victory seemed certain. But once they were inside the walls, they began to notice things that did not quite fit. The defenses were not just the usual steppe fortifications. There were shields arranged so tightly that they overlapped like fish scales. And among the defenders were men who looked nothing like the Central Asian tribes the Chinese were used to fighting. In fact, these foreign-looking faces were unusual enough to be written down in the historical records. And it is this reason, this battle, which might have been remembered as just another victory, became something far more mysterious. Because some believe those unfamiliar men may have come from the Mediterranean. Some historians suggest they were possibly Romans. But how would Romans end up at a battle in the middle of Central Asia? Were they lost? Hired guns? Or were they not Romans at all, but another group who just resembled them? To even take a guess, we have to go back and follow a long chain of events, one that ties two empires on opposite sides of the world together, and the thread that connects them, the Silk Road. By the end of the ancient world, the West had its giant. Rome began as a republic and grew into an empire, and it saw itself as the center of everything, the strongest power around, the most orderly, and the most advanced. But far to the east stood another giant. With its vast territory and vassal states, it was just as sophisticated, and in many ways, even larger. This was China under the Han Dynasty. Between them lay deserts, mountains, and politics. Still, each wanted what the other made. Silk moved west from China. Wine and glassware moved east from Rome. And at times, the trade was enormous. You might think that meant the Romans and Chinese knew each other well. Not even close. The Silk Road was never one clean route. It was a web of crossings and detours that spread out across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Goods changed hands again and again before reaching their destination. And at the center of that web stood the middlemen, particularly the Parthians. The Parthian Empire, ruling Persia, sat between the two superpowers. Its real power came from a simple truth: control the road, and you control the profit. The mystery was useful. Roman envoys looking to venture east were told stories of endless, impassable deserts. Chinese envoys looking west were warned of dangerous seas, when in reality, Roman ships were already sailing to Indian ports, sometimes making the trip in only a few months. The Silk Road was a tangle, and at important junctions sat someone who could deliberately divert caravans, lose a letter, or simply confiscate the goods. As for historical archives, Chinese records spoke of a distant western land called Da-Qin. Roman writers mentioned a mysterious silk-producing country called Serica. Each side had heard of the other, but mostly through merchants and rumors. The middlemen kept it a secret, and had every reason to do so. Now keep in mind, the Silk Road. Rome's eastern ambitions eventually collided with the very empire that stood between it and the Silk Road. And in 53 BCE, the Roman general, Marcus Licinius Crassus, led an army into Parthian territory. These Romans were one of the best drilled soldiers on earth, about to face a pack of horse-riding tribes in what should have been an easy win. But the open plains of Mesopotamia were quick to expose the weakness in that confidence. The Romans faced an enemy that refused to fight on Roman terms. Parthian horse archers poured arrows, armored cataphracts destroyed the formations, and in no time, the Roman army shattered. Crassus was killed, and thousands of soldiers were imprisoned. Now, usually, captured soldiers in the ancient world would be sold for labor. But here, the story takes a turn. Some old accounts say these Romans were never sold at all. Instead, they were moved, pushed deep into the eastern edge of the Parthian world, to a far-off region called Margiana. And there, the trail goes cold. What happened to them? Did they farm? Did they fight? Did they just disappear? Well, the Parthians barely kept records. And what little we know of them comes from archaeology and the passing mentions of other people's histories. So where did the Romans go? We don't really know, until we look even farther east, into the records of China. And that takes us right back to the fortress of Juju. In 36 BCE, out on the Central Asian steppe, a Xiongnu chieftain named Juju was carving out a kingdom of his own. The Xiongnu were fierce, fast-moving nomads who lived by their horses and their raids. Juju and his army forced the surrounding tribes into submission. For China, that was a serious problem. Many of those tribes were China's allies, many of whom lived along the Silk Road. And Juju's new grip was eating into their economy. So, China sent an army on a long march west to bring him down. The target was his fortress, in what is now Kazakhstan. The Chinese defeated him with ease. But the victory itself is not the interesting part. The real highlight is what the soldiers saw. Foot soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, arranged in tight, disciplined rows, with shields locked together like fish scales. This was the only known instance from that period in which Chinese chronicles described anything like this, and for centuries, no one paid much attention to what those formations might have been. Until, in 1957, an American sinologist named Homer Dubbs decided to take a closer look. A sinologist is basically a scholar who studies China, its history, language, and culture. Dubbs believed those interlocking shields sounded a great deal like a Roman testudo, or the turtle formation, where soldiers locked their shields together into a shell to block incoming arrows. So he asked himself an interesting question. Could these have been the Roman prisoners captured in Carrhae, who were then hauled east and then forced to fight all over again? And it wouldn't be completely impossible to picture that. Men stuck thousands of miles from home with nothing left to their name but their combat expertise. What else would they have to sell? However, a possible connection backed with a good story isn't the same as proof, and some big questions hung in the air. The biggest one: what happened to these fighters at the Battle of Zhizhi after their defeat? Well, China actually had written laws for handling prisoners, and most of the time, captives were resettled inside the empire and put to work as farmers or laborers. However, high-ranked fighters were treated differently. They were sent to the frontier, kept under close watch, and turned into border guards for the empire. The records say those prisoners were sent to a place called Liqian in northwest China, and that is where the records become silent. There would be no further mention about them. But why? Well, mainly due to the nature of ancient record-keeping, which cared more about great victories and ruling dynasties, not the lives of prisoners, no matter how unusual they were. However, it would still be too early to close the case. The big question still remained. Were those men actually Romans? The Romans were famous for fighting behind locked, overlapping shields, but they weren't the only ones. There were someone else, particularly in that part of the world, who did that as well. And, to learn who they could have been, we would need to go back even further, a few centuries actually. In 330 BCE, the Greek-Macedonian army, led by Alexander the Great, had crushed the Persian Empire and driven all the way into Central Asia. Their signature move was the phalanx, shields overlapping and spears jutting out in a bristling wall. Now, Alexander and his empire did not last long. However, he left a long-lasting legacy. After he died, his empire broke apart into smaller Greek kingdoms led by his generals, the ones we call the Hellenistic kingdoms. And some of these were still around when the fortress fell. These Hellenistic kingdoms each carried rich histories of their own, but the one most relevant to our story is the Seleucid Empire. In the 200s BCE, its king began losing his grip over the eastern regions, and, as a result of that, formed two new breakaway kingdoms, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and the Indo-Greek kingdom. These two regions expanded their territories far beyond the existing Greek influence. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom spread deep into the Hindu Kush and across parts of present-day Afghanistan and northwestern India, integrating with local cultures while establishing new centers of Greek rule. The Indo-Greek kingdom pushed even further, conquering lands deep into central India, regions Alexander the Great had never reached when he halted his campaign at the borders of the Mauryan Empire centuries earlier. Now, given the proximity of these kingdoms to the Xiongnu tribes, it is quite possible those unidentified warriors may have been soldiers of these breakaway kingdoms. But that idea has a hole in it too. If Greek kingdoms ran the surrounding regions for more than 300 years, why don't we have more records of such combat? And why is there no clear mention, even in Greek sources, of Greek mercenaries aiding the Xiongnu? After all, the Greeks were among the ancient world's most prolific record keepers. So, who really were they? Greeks? Romans? Someone else entirely? Well, the best clue might simply be timing. Romans were captured in Carrhae in 53 BCE. The fortress of Juju fell just 17 years later. That is a short enough gap that men captured young would still be fit and in good health, and could still be in fighting shape, being passed from one master to the next. And for men who would never see home again, the only thing that mattered was staying alive. That meant being useful to anyone who fed them and anyone who had the power to keep them alive.